Ladies and gentlemen, I'm privileged to be here and talk to you about something that Professor Akan has already given me the baseline. I'll actually expand on something that has to do with real-life studies and on specifically about databases, because this is something that would make the planet as we live on a common ground for clinical research. I have some disclosures here, nothing in relation to this presentation. As you know, progress in medical science is based on clinical research, and as already stated, there are different clinical trials that we may indulge upon. The classical randomized clinical trials is the gold standard that we have all accepted as to assess the efficacy and safety of drugs. And we also have the pragmatic trials that Professor Khan alluded to, and we have the observational studies. And they have different features. The classical randomized control trials, they are the backbone of drug licensing and registration, as you know. They answer clinical questions, but not all clinical questions. And they are the basis of most guidelines for treatment and management of different diseases. The pragmatic trials, they are some sort of in between classical and observational studies. They are a subtype of randomized control trials. They compare medical interventions, use broader eligibility criteria for patients, and they need consent limits numbers of patients and introduce some bias, therefore. Observational studies, they offer high extent of validity. They are less costly in terms of proper organizations of assessment and documenting all different outcomes. They address longer-term aspects of different diseases, and they shed light on aspects of patient care not addressed by randomized clinical trials and pragmatic trials. So basically what we have with randomized clinical trials is a clinical design that has to be well recorded. You have per protocol analysis at the end of the study, and you have dropout of patients during the clinical study that somehow introduce some bias in terms of the overall end conclusions of the trial. Clinical trials endorsed for providing evidence need to be double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized, and in line with the good clinical practices that we know of. And there has been one very well known to all of you table with levels of evidence as accepted by the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute in the States. And it's the randomized control trials that provide the richest body of evidence, and that they are considered the type A evidence for giving the green light for subsequent approval of a given drug or intervention. But do double-blind placebo-controlled trials reliably reflect the effectiveness of medical products that are studied? There's something that has to do with the overall planning and design of those trials. It has become evident over the years that if you preset certain eligibility criteria for patients, you can achieve certain expected results. And this was something that was put in writing by Leif Bermer from the University in Lund in Sweden, evidence-based recommendations, or show me the patient selected, and I will tell you the results. And this is because when you set up eligibility criteria, inclusion, exclusion criteria for selection of patients, in the different phases of the clinical research, you exclude a substantial number of real-life patients which you would otherwise treat if you are practicing medicine. So you can see the phase 1, 2, 3, and 4 trials where you have all those eligibility criteria that you have to stick to. And then when you have to collect post-marketing experience, and when you start collecting data from real life, where you have no set up eligibility criteria, then things turn out a little bit different. And you see this waterfall of eligibility of 870 asthmatics when you apply the randomized control trials rules to them. You end up with just less than 1% of patients that are included in those restricted by pre-eligibility criteria clinical trials, representative of all asthmatic patients, which certainly doesn't make much good sense. Sorry, for some reason there's, I push hard, I think, but maybe it doesn't, maybe the battery is low. I can't change the slide. Okay, I changed it now. So the big difference between the classical randomized clinical trials are the questions that you answer. So the classical randomized control trials is stating that, is asking the question whether this intervention work under ideal conditions, or the real life studies ask the question, does this intervention work under usual conditions? So the pragmatic, the real life studies can be subdivided into pragmatic randomized trials, something that I showed to begin with, and the observational trials. And part of the observational trials include these database trials that I'll be mentioning now. I won't, for the sake of time, I won't indulge in pragmatic trials any longer. There are some criteria. Doesn't, okay. The interesting thing about real life studies is that you have to keep doing clinical trials that are within the range of real life studies in order to prove the value of real life studies. It's some sort of sophism. So the database studies are a subtype of real-life clinical trials. They have similar approach in terms of selection of patients. They use different sources of data. Those data could be clinical records in places where you have a good system of archiving data for the patients. And electronic databases could encompass millions of patients. You can use as source payment systems of different countries. You can also include some pre-planned studies and surveys where you have a much limited number of studies. You could also use sources of social services which are less reliable in terms of quality of the data. This is the Tower of Babel. Maybe you may remember there's a book of Genesis which is telling the story about how God punished people who were trying to build a tower high enough to reach the skies and heavens. This tower, by the way, is told to be 93 meters high, so in contemporary terms, it didn't turn out to be something quite high. But anyway, they went up in the skies and they kept building the tower, and then God came down to see what they were doing. And those people were speaking the same language because they were the heirs of Noah's Ark's survival, the big flood at the biblical times. And they all shared the same motives and the same incentive to become part of, to reach the heavens, so to say. And God then thought that they'll challenge his domination and his supremacy, and then he deprived them of the ability to speak the same language. And they started speaking different languages, and he dispersed them all around the globe. There was no globe at the time, there was just a world, and they went to different places, and they couldn't actually understand what each other was talking, what they were talking to each other. And at the end of the day, the tower was not built in order to achieve this supreme goal of challenging God and going to the heavens. And basically what we need now is to unify the different databases that we can use for real-life observational studies. And there have been different indices that are telling us about the condition of the patients, not only about management of clinical trials. And there's this dose index, dyspnea, airflow obstruction, smoking status, and exacerbation frequency, which is derived from validated international data sets, and not only from randomized control trials. And this is a good example of how real-life data can serve the purpose of making good guidelines on the basis of real-life data. But is it the same real life? Oops. Is it the same real life in different places? We have some very well characterized populations, and as Professor Akan mentioned, it's different from country to country. We have some bigger countries with big resources, and you have, for instance, in the UK primary care, 2 million patients within the unified system for collection of patient data of the Midlands of the UK. And at the same time, there's again a waterfall of different levels of proficiency of the healthcare systems in different other countries. So you can't really afford those different countries. They can't afford to organize one such expensive system to account for different patient populations. So what we need under these circumstances is some correction factor, some interface between what you have in the big databases and what you need in the different other places where you don't have such databases. I'll skip some of those things because I want to stick to the time limits. So what we need under these circumstances is plan in advance what should be the coding and what should be the structure of the different databases. And for instance, because I'm on the side of respiratory medicine and allergies, I give you some example with the UK databases that assess and follow up patients with asthma and COPD. And there's a controversy whether they should have all different demographic and objective measures included in those databases. and whether the practices allow performing all these objective measures. But certainly, it's the more data you collect, the more different outcomes you have in the databases, the more useful these databases could be in terms of analyzing the data about how you achieve certain treatment and management goals. I'll skip that once again because I want to go to just mention that it's a matter of good quality of the data that we talk about. And in order to have those quality checks, we need checklists that are part of different international systems for quality control, like the Composite for observational epidemiology trials, like the European Medicinal Agency and CEP for pharmacovigilance, and the ARCH conference reported as supplement of the American Thoracic Society, and so on. There are certainly many different confounding factors. Selection bias is one of the things that might be part of this hurdle. Information bias may also be part of the problems that we encounter when we analyze those big databases. Recall bias, when you want to have some retrospective data announced by the patients, is a big problem sometimes. Detection bias is something when you can't allow for the treatment group to be compared to the placebo group or the comparator. So clinical data sets, they concentrate on what is well recorded. They may have somewhat lower quality of the data. They vary over time, and these are deficits, but they can use large numbers, lots of characteristics. They follow up over long periods of time. They account for accurate prescribing data and hospitalizations. Individuals can be tracked, so you can have implications for the specific individual patient. And they can identify missed opportunities, which is something great. Just to give you the example of a study of almost 40,000 subjects over 20 years, and they recorded over time those patients who became COPD patients, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease patients. And it turned out that there had been missed opportunities 5 years before the actual disease was diagnosed. So on the basis of the analysis, the researchers could actually pinpoint those patients who were wrongly misdiagnosed and dismissed as COPD patients at risk. So quality of standards can be checked. Optimal data collection should be made at the time of putting together the database so as to get better results later. Setting up databases is an investment into the future. Using existing cohorts saves time and money. So strategies are needed to come up with a coefficient of approximation for the different patients and for the different databases. And this is especially valid for countries which can't afford the big databases. And this is the prerequisite to build the Babel tower to the top to get to heavens. So thank you for your attention.